Hello there, welcome back and welcome to a one-off video. Today I am going to show you how I made this diorama of a London Underground engineering vehicle in a tube tunnel. Now, I didn't originally intend to make this into a video. This was a project for a leaving present for someone at work. And I hadn't really planned on turning it into a video at all, but I'm very happy with how this has turned out in the end. So I thought, well, why not? But anyway, the upshot of that is that I haven't filmed any of my actual modelling here. So instead, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to talk through what I've actually done right from the start. So we'll start off by giving you a bit of an overview of the model itself. So I'll just take the case off. And what we've got here is what we call a battery locomotive. This is an engineering vehicle which can be powered from the track, can also be powered by batteries, and that is inside a London Underground tube tunnel. And there you go, there's a different view. So one by one I will go through the processes that I used to create this model. So starting off with the materials, the actual model of the vehicle itself is a CAD scan of an actual vehicle, and that was 3D printed for me, so I didn't do the 3D printing for that. But it's a really nice, very high detail model. As you can see, you've got the air hoses that make up the air circuit around the train, you've got the couplings, you've got various rail anchors, buffers, lights, power supplies. You've even got a bit of interior detail such as chairs. You've got the actual controller switch handle there. There's a lot of detail going on here. So that is a really nice model. Everything else, so that model itself, I just painted and weathered. Everything else is stuff that I have designed and made myself. So the tunnel is made up of individual segments. So these are just sort of arc shapes with an interior kind of webbing design. And they've been glued together to create a tunnel, which is of course the correct sort of scale for this model. And then they've been weathered to suit. So I sprayed them black initially, then I put some brown wash on, and then I've also added some sort of seepage kind of detail. If you've ever gone on the underground, you'll know that sometimes these tunnel rings leak and you get sort of salt or rust sort of coming through and seeping down the sides of the walls, that kind of thing. So adds to the sort of the detail of it. Now these sleepers, these are simply mahogany planks of wood that I have cut to an appropriate length and then I've weathered. You'll note that the sections which lie underneath the vehicles are significantly more oily and dirty than the sections either side. That is very deliberate. The rails, these are simply brass eye sections. Because of the scale I was working in, I couldn't actually find any proper rail. My initial hope was I could find a model railway or something that was in an appropriate scale, but alas not. So these are simply eye sections that I have painted and then weathered. I've sort of painted them silver initially and then masked over and sprayed the rest brown to give the idea of a rusted rail with a section that has wheel wear on it at all times. And then finally the traction rails here are, again, they're just aluminium bar that I have cut to the right size and then weathered. The ballast, or the rock that the track sits on, is aquarium gravel, the sort of stuff that you would put in your fish tank. So lots of bits and bobs that perhaps don't necessarily belong in models, but nonetheless which have been used reasonably effectively to create what is quite a nice diorama. Now in terms of scaling, this wasn't actually the easiest thing in the world to do because the model itself isn't really to any specific scale. It's accurate to the real thing, of course, but working out what that scale was really important because obviously you had to get the tunnel rings and stuff to match, and that was kind of challenging. So, from just going on Tinterweb, I was able to find out that a battery loco is 8 feet 7.5 inches wide, which translates to 2,629 millimeters. And I also knew that my actual model was 126.5 millimeters wide. So from that, I could work out an appropriate scale, which was 1 to 20.8, which I basically made 1 to 20. And that sort of gave me the ability to work out the dimensions of everything else. So using 1 to 20, I could then go and work out what my tunnel diameter would have to be. Now, London Underground tunnels actually vary in diameter quite a lot, depending on when they were made and indeed what part of the tunnel you're in, station, running line, old, new, whatever. But the sort of standard deep tube tunnel is 11 feet 8 inches wide in diameter, which translates to 3.5 meters, 3.56 meters. So in scale terms, that translates to an internal diameter of 171 millimeters. So the internal diameter from here across to the other side of the tunnel is 171. And that gives you an appropriate scale. And as you can see, the vehicle is appropriately scaled in the tunnel. And if you've ever been on the London Underground, you will know that there is a precious little margin between the top of the vehicle and the top of the tunnel. Would you make a train like that now? Would you make an underground system like that now? Of course you wouldn't. But this was built many, many years ago, almost 160 years ago. Well, in fact, in some cases, over 160 years ago. So, tunnel's nice and tight. The overall diameter from the outside there to the other side is 185 because these segments are 7 millimeters in total. So 171 internal diameter plus 2 lots of 7, 185. Nice and easy. I then also use this scaling factor to work out the distance between the rails. So of course, we all know what standard gauge is, 4 foot 8.5 inches, and then from that you can work out how far apart your rails need to be. I then did the traction rails. For those who don't know, the London Underground uses 2 conductor rails. You've got a positive rail here and a negative rail here, and between them they give you 630 volts, although on some lines it's actually up to 750 now. And they are separated from the sleepers and insulated via these little pots, which are normally made out of a ceramic material. So these are just some little brass door handles that I've painted up and so on. Anyway, those dimensions again were all taken from the 1 to 20 measurement. Of course, one thing I should say here is that it's bloody nerve-wracking because it takes an awfully long time to get this printed out, and it takes an awfully long time to assemble this tunnel. And the first time you put the model in the tunnel, it's quite nerve-wracking because obviously you hope that your maths is right, but there's always a chance you've cocked something up somewhere. And if the model hadn't fitted into the tunnel, that would have been a lot of wasted 3D printing filament. So I was very relieved that this happened on the first attempt. So in terms of the CAD work I did, I started by making this, which is a sort of end section. And this was printed in one go. And as you can see, it has all the detail of the tunnel rings, but they're not independent pieces. This is one full section. And the idea behind this was so that it allowed me to have a perfect circle to start building the tunnel rings from, so that my tunnel actually appeared circular. And it also gave me that backing sheet so that you couldn't see behind the model. So this was a really good place to start. And having done that, I then also printed out a whole bunch of these, and these are the actual tunnel ring segments. So 8 of these make up a circle. So this is 45 degrees of a 180 millimeter diameter circle. Here's one that I 3D printed and ended up not using. I mean, I haven't even got rid of the 3D printing marks on it, but you can kind of see how it sort of comes together. It's a little bit rough because you've got quite a lot of overhangs. This was printed in this direction, so of course these sections were not the easiest to print out, but nonetheless, a little bit of sort of post work after the 3D printing, and it came out very nicely. And I printed sort of 15 or 20 of those out, and then just glued them all together and it ended up working very well.
And just to give you an idea of what this was like, that's a shot of one of the tunnel ring segments, freshly printed, and that is a selection of tunnel ring segments being printed out. You can see there's about 8 or 9 being printed in one go there. I just left those to print overnight, really. And on the kitchen table now, that is all the tunnel rings ready for assembly. Cleaning these up was really just a case of going over with a pair of clippers and a sharp microfile and just sort of clearing up any printing residue, any little bits that didn't quite fit properly. Any sort of errors in the print where it sort of shifted 0.5 millimetre further across than it should on a layer, and any sort of overhangs which looked a bit sort of grimy. But a fairly simple job to sort of straighten these out, albeit quite time consuming because there were so many parts to process.
So as you can see, this is the main ring that I showed you from the CAD, and then if I rotate the model around, you can see that all of these other tunnel rings are just glued onto that. So I've got 5, I think in total I've got just over a half a circle. Yes, I've got 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And to give the model a bit of interest, I've sort of jigsawed it a little bit to make it look a little bit more interesting. I sort of flirted with the idea of just having a straight line, but I thought that was a little bit more interesting. And I have to say, I found building the tunnel was probably the highlight of building this model, because it was just very interesting. I mean, you know, this is how tunnels are actually made. You know, you bore out your hole, and then you support the structure with these tunnel rings. So it was very, very like the real thing. So it's very, very satisfying, and I was very pleased by how it worked out in the end. I mean, obviously, you know, if you look closely, you can see very clearly that these are 3D prints. You can see your printing lines and so on and so on. I'm not too worried about the sort of disturbance on the inside, because these tunnels are filthy. So, you know, a little bit of sort of stray printing plastic actually gets disguised very well as bits of dust or dirt or cobwebs or whatever, the things that build up in these tunnels over the years. So that all looks pretty good to me.
Just to give you an idea of what the tunnel looked like before the vehicle went in, and just to give you a sort of idea of what the sort of internal structure looks like. This is a photo that I took just before I did the really sort of heavy weathering. So I'd painted it black at this point, and I just started to pick out some highlights in a sort of matte brown, but no really heavy weathering at this point. So you can see some of the remnants of the 3D printing quite clearly here. But I mean, to me, I think in some ways they actually sort of add to the detail, because they make it look like there's sort of dust and grime building up. So a little bit of sort of non-uniformity and a bit of distress actually, I think, helps this quite effectively, really.
Now the ballast, or this sort of stony floor to the tunnel, I originally said this was made from aquarium gravel. It's actually not. It's made from horticultural grit. And if there is a difference between aquarium gravel and horticultural grit, you know more about small stones than I do. But this was very fun to do, although very simple. I simply put a lot of this stuff in a bowl and sort of massaged it with some watered down PVA glue, and then poured it into the bottom of the tunnel and leveled it. I then left it out in the sun for about 5 hours, and over that time the glue sort of hardened up. But there were still quite a few slightly loose stones, so what I then did is went over the whole lot with a pipette, filled with some watered down PVA glue, and did a few coats of that, just sort of saturating all the stones with watered down glue. The idea being that that glue then seeps down into the gravel, glues everything nicely in place, and sort of solidifies it. Nice and easy. Now, in terms of how I actually made the rails, there are 2 rails here, and I'll just show you on the actual model. You've got the running rails, which the wheels of the vehicle go on, and then you've got these, which are called the conductor rails or the traction rails. These are the rails that supply electricity into the vehicle, which provide it with traction. And they are made of different things. Running rails tend to be made of, well, running rails are made of steel. Traction rails are made out of a few different things, normally aluminium. although don't quote me on that, but I think it's aluminium. Anyway, so to make the running rails, 1 to 20 isn't really a scale that exists anywhere in the model railway world, so I had to kind of work with what I had. And I used some I section, which I think comes from Albion Alloys, but I'm not certain. And this is brass originally. So what I did, obviously rails don't want to look like they're made of brass, they need to look like they're sort of rusted steel. So I painted the railhead silver, and then I masked over a very small section of that silver and sprayed a sort of rust brown colour, and that gives the impression of a rusted steel rail which has frequent interface with wheels from the train on top, which is quite a nice effect, and then just simply cut to length and glued on the top of the sleepers. Same process really for the traction rail. This is just some aluminium bar, and I've sort of painted 3 of the sides black, a wee bit of weathering, and then I tried the same thing on top, where I masked over a section, painted the black, and then sort of, well, I wanted to give the impression of a sort of surface that's had some running on it. It didn't really work, so what I did in the end instead was strip it back so that the entire top surface was a sort of clean aluminium, and then I've simply added some weathering on top of that to make it look like it's not pristine and clean. But the rails, nice and simple, and as I say, the traction rails are fitted on top of what we actually call pots, but these are just ceramic sort of plates which lift the traction rails off the sleeper and stop, or at least minimise, any leakage currents getting out into the ground and into the tunnel.
So as you can see, this is the model having just finished painting before any weathering has been done, and you'll notice a few things. Firstly, it looks far too clean, so the absolute definite next step is to go on and weather it and sort of knock back those clear fresh colours and just make it look like it's actually had a bit of life and a bit of service. But you'll notice as well some of the more delicate parts of the model, things like the headlights and the grab rails and so on, they are not yet fitted to the model, and that's very deliberate, because these things are far easier to paint when they're not connected to the model, but also they're very vulnerable, you know, they're very easy to break, so it's a much more sensible thing to leave those off and to fit them right at the last moment when there's the least possible chance that they're actually going to pick up any damage.
Now, as you've seen, when I'd originally painted the model, I painted the whole thing black to start with, and then I did the yellow, which took a hell of a lot of coats to cover over the black, but, you know, such is life. Then I did the roof surface, and then I picked out the individual details. So I did the sort of the red bar along the buffers, picked out the detailing on the handles and the brake pipes and so on. I also painted through the windows to get the chairs painted, and also the traction handle and stuff painted, that sort of thing as well. So that was all reasonably time consuming, but not a particular challenge. But as you've seen in the photos I've just shown you, the model looked far too fresh. These are models these are vehicles that never interact with the public. You know, these are engineering vehicles. They pull engineering trains. They don't work with the public. And as such, it's perhaps fair to say that they don't perhaps get the love and care that they deserve, certainly not aesthetically. So they do tend to look like they're doing a hard job. You know, they've got a fair amount of weathering on them. And normally I'm fairly cautious when I weather models, because it's very easy to overdo things. And the same is probably true here, but nonetheless I have done a fair amount of weathering. But I have only actually used 4 things. I started out just by knocking back all of the bright paint colours just with this dark brown wash, literally just painting over the whole thing. Whenever I weather, I always try to do it in the direction that water would flow. So on the roof, I've only painted downwards. Same on the sides, I've just painted downwards like that. Having done the dark wash, that just kind of took the bright edge off all the colours. I then did a black wash on top of that, because the London Underground has a lot of what's called tunnel dust in it, and that sort of metallic, very fine dust, but it's very black and it gets everywhere. So I picked out a lot of the detail with that black. So for example, you can see the doorway here, the rim around that has black in it, and that sort of highlights that there's a gap between the door and the vehicle, but it also just sort of like picks out that there's a lot of dust adhering to that. And I use the same thing around quite a lot of the sort of the switches and stuff. You know, I put a little bit of the black wash, and the capillary action just sort of pulls that round and highlights the detail very nicely. And the final wash that I used was this rust wash, and this is just a slightly different colour brown, a slightly lighter colour brown, that gives you these sort of like slight rusty kind of marks, which nonetheless look very nice. The final thing I used was this U-rust, or powdered oxide. This is basically just powdered iron that you mix with water and then you paint it on. So what you end up with is oxidized iron, which is literally rust. And that's how I've managed to get the sort of the rust on the buffers and the coupling here, down here, that sort of streak on the tunnel wall. And with this kind of thing, I always sort of try to do it where water would pool. So, you know, you've got a handle here, water's going to dribble down there, collect here. You've got a tread plate just here where muddy, wet boots are going to press on as drivers climb up into the vehicle. Again, that'll get nice and rusty. But this is wonderful stuff. And you know, it looks the real deal because it is literally actual rust. So that's, you know, that's great stuff. I always love using that. And that was it really. So with this model, I certainly went pretty heavy with the weathering, but I think it looks pretty good. I think the fact that it's quite a yellow model, it's quite bright, means that it can take a fair amount of knocking back, because, you know, yellow is always just going to show up a lot of marks. So you can sort of get away with a wee bit more. And then from perusing photos of these locomotives on the internet, I've sort of gone and rusted things where I think they would legitimately get rust, particularly on moving parts like this coupling here, which sometimes is in use, sometimes isn't. Water's going to pool in the joints and stuff. These buffers are going to get covered in grease and oil. Any paint that's on these buffers is going to quite regularly get damaged when they actually interact with other vehicle buffers. So you are going to have exposed metal there, which is then of course going to start rusting. So as always with weathering, I've tried to sort of do it in areas that logically make sense. So for example, I haven't rusted the aluminium top because aluminium ain't gonna rust. But I've done a few streaks here and there. And I'm very happy with the result. So there you go. One final thing, it's very hard to see underneath, but you can just see the train's bogie and wheel just resting on the actual running rail. So I'll see if I can get an angle of that underneath. You can just see again there, you've got the wheels resting on the actual running rail. And that was actually, initially I hadn't thought I'd bother doing that, but then it actually ended up being very useful, because by modelling that, I was actually able to make sure that the model sat absolutely true right in the middle of the tunnel. So it actually ended up being a very useful technique to centre the model properly. So anyway, there you go. That is my model of a London Underground battery locomotive, 1:20 scale, in a tube tunnel. As I say, no actual images of me doing the modelling, for which I apologise. If I'd thought about it, I probably would have videoed myself, but I didn't think about it till too late in the process. So there you go, these things happen. But hopefully that was an interesting little model. Quite different to the stuff I normally do, but all the better for it really. Lots of things that I hadn't done before, lots of things that I really enjoyed doing, and I would quite like to do some more railway models actually in the future. So I might well carry on with this sort of thing. I think if I'd had a bit more time, I'd have quite liked to have put some lights on this. You can get sort of like blue flickering lights, and I thought, you know, one of those underneath the model to sort of simulate arcing and sparking on the conductor rails would look really cool. Particularly in the darkness of the tunnel, that sort of flashing light would, I think, look really nice. And also maybe could have put some lights in the actual cabin of the vehicle. But all in all, I'm really happy with how this turned out. It looks like a really nice model. And yeah, I think it's quite a unique piece, really. So there you go. Hope you enjoyed it. If you've got any questions, comments, what have you, smack them down below and I will do my absolute best to get back to you. I'm afraid I can't provide any of the actual CAD models for this. I don't own the CAD model for the locomotive, so I'm afraid, as much as I'm sure quite a lot of people would like it, I'm afraid I can't help you there. My apologies for that. I can provide tunnel rings and stuff, so if you're interested, give me a shout and I can provide you the CAD models for the tunnel rings. But equally, they're not hard to build up yourself. If you want to have a go at that sort of thing, it's quite a nice, quite a quick project. So yeah, if you've got any questions or comments, pop them down below and I'll do my best to get back to you. And I will see you soon, hopefully, for some more Mauritania building. Bye for now.